When I was 12, my family moved to a small rural town in the Midwest. We lived in a house surrounded by thick woods. As a kid, I loved exploring the forest, pretending I was an adventurer discovering new lands. However, one particular day still haunts me. It was late autumn, the trees were nearly bare, and the forest was covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves. I decided to venture deeper into the woods than I ever had before. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to look closer. The cabin was old, with broken windows and a sagging roof. I noticed something odd as I approached. The front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. I walked through the small living room and into what appeared to be a bedroom. I saw an old, rusty bed frame with a filthy mattress in the corner of the room. What caught my attention, though, was a large wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It looked ancient, with intricate carvings on its surface. My heart pounded with excitement and fear as I approached the chest. I knelt down and slowly lifted the lid. Inside I found old photographs and documents, yellowed with age. Most were unremarkable, but one photograph made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a man standing in front of the very cabin I was in. His eyes seemed to pierce through the photograph, staring directly at me. I quickly shoved the photo back into the chest and closed the lid. As I stood up, I heard a creaking noise from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The cabin felt colder, and I had an overwhelming sense of being watched. I hurried out of the cabin and ran back towards my house, not stopping until I was safely inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photograph and my eerie feeling in the cabin. The next day I told my parents about what I had found, but they dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few weeks later, I was out in the woods again, trying to enjoy my usual adventures. As I wandered, I felt like someone was following me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. Then, out of my eye, I saw a figure standing among the trees. The man from the photograph was staring at me with the same intense gaze. I ran home as fast as I could and never returned to that part of the woods. Years later, I learned that the cabin had once belonged to a hermit who had mysteriously disappeared. Some said he had died in the woods. Others claimed he had gone mad and wandered off. But to this day I believe his spirit still haunts those woods, watching anyone who dares to enter. I moved into an old apartment building in the city's heart a few years ago. It had a charming vintage feel with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings. It was a bit run down but had character, and the rent was affordable. My neighbors were mostly elderly folks who had lived there for decades. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. One night, I was awakened by footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. It was strange because it was well past midnight, and the building was usually quiet at that hour. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing back and forth. I listened for a while, trying to convince myself it was just one of my neighbors, before falling back asleep. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes they would start early in the morning, and other times they would start late at night. No matter the time, they always stopped outside my door. I asked my neighbors if they had heard anything, but they all claimed they hadn't noticed anything unusual. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I was watching TV on my couch when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were accompanied by a faint whispering sound. I muted the TV and strained to hear. It was a man's voice, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door. I pressed my ear against it, hoping to catch more of the conversation, but the whispering stopped abruptly. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I decided to set up a small camera in the hallway, hoping to catch whoever was behind the disturbances. I recorded hours of footage for several nights, but each time I reviewed it, I saw nothing. The footsteps and whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I started losing sleep, feeling like I was constantly being watched. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold breeze sweep through my room. I got up to check the windows, but they were all closed. Then I heard the whispering again, louder this time, as if it was right next to me. I turned on the light, and to my horror, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room. It was a tall man, his face obscured by darkness. I froze, too terrified to move. The figure slowly approached my bed, the whispering growing louder. I could finally make out the words, "Get out." My body responded before my mind did. I left the apartment and spent the night at a friend's place. The next day I contacted my landlord and explained the situation. He seemed unfazed and reluctantly admitted that a previous tenant, an old man, had died in my apartment years ago. He had no family and had spent his final days alone and forgotten. I moved out as soon as possible but could not stay another night in that apartment. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm alone. I often wonder if the old man is still there, pacing the halls, whispering his warnings to anyone who dares to stay. I was a night shift security guard several years ago at an abandoned hospital. The hospital had been closed for nearly a decade, but the building was still standing, awaiting demolition. My job was to patrol the halls and ensure no one trespassed or vandalized the property. It was a quiet job, perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. The hospital was eerie at night. The only light came from my flashlight and the occasional flickering overhead light. The walls were lined with peeling paint and old medical posters, and the rooms were filled with decaying hospital beds and rusting equipment. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I never felt scared until that night. It was a cold winter evening, and the wind howled outside, making the old building creak and groan. I was making my rounds on the third floor when I heard a faint sound coming down the hallway. It was soft at first, like the shuffling of feet, but it grew louder as I approached. I called out, thinking it might be a stray animal, but there was no response. I continued down the hall, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, and I was left in silence. As I turned to go, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I swung my flashlight towards it, but there was nothing there. It's just an empty hallway. Feeling uneasy, I cut my rounds short and headed back to the security office. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed as I walked. I saw nothing every time I looked over my shoulder, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I reviewed the footage from the security cameras back in the security office. Most cameras were old, and the footage was grainy, but something caught my eye. In the footage from the third floor, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, right where I had heard the noises. The figure was tall and seemed to be watching me. As I moved down the hall, the figure didn't move, but it disappeared when I turned my back. Chills ran down my spine as I watched the footage repeatedly, trying to understand what I saw. I stayed in the security office for the rest of my shift, not wanting to encounter whatever lurked in the halls. Over the next few nights, the activity escalated. I heard whispers echoing through the halls, saw fleeting shadows darting around corners, and felt an icy presence behind me. Each time I reviewed the footage, the figure was there, always watching, always waiting. One night I gathered the courage to confront whatever was haunting the hospital. I armed myself with a flashlight and a metal baton and headed to the third floor. As I walked down the hallway, the air grew colder and the whispers grew louder. I reached the end of the hall and turned to face the darkness. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty halls. For a moment there was only silence. Then a cold breeze swept past me, and I heard a voice whisper, "Leave." I didn't need any more convincing. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the building and in my car. I quit my job the next day and never looked back. Years later, I learned that the hospital had been the site of numerous deaths, and that many believed it to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. I still think about that figure in the hallway who watched me every night. I wonder if it's still there, waiting for its next victim.